am so glad that you could all make it to BEJS 2027, right? And we have our first speaker up in like a moment, but I want to take the time to introduce him. So from my notes, I think they're from 2023 because they say that Kyle has only written like 11 plus books, but it must be 21 plus books by now, right? So, you know, like, let's not bother with that bio and just jump right into this next talk that is A Tale of Two Webs. Kyle?
Thank you so much for being here. This is wild, attending a conference completely in VR. I see all of you have your VR glasses plugged in because I can see all of you here. And can you imagine, give a hand to the staff of this conference for building this VR model for us. This is incredible, all the booths and everything. Unbelievable. And how much better is it that we get to gather here? I hear in Brussels it's actually quite rainy and sort of cold. I myself am on an island at the beach enjoying while also giving you this talk. So it is just amazing. And I just want to give a shout out to, I think it's VRGPT 19.3 is the one that rendered this, and it only took 6 hours to render this whole model. It's really incredible. Do you remember 4 years ago? I see many of the same faces here. I was on this stage just 4 years ago, back in 2023. It seems like only yesterday, but I was here and I was giving a talk about the future of the web. And I thought, you know, a lot of things have changed in the web, but a lot of things are still kind of the same. And so I thought it would be actually really interesting for us to go back and revisit this talk. So here I was on stage back in 2023 with A Tale of Two Webs, and I wanted to kind of revisit that talk and update it for now in 2027. By the way, my slides, if you have the latest technical preview of Reality OS, you should be able to explore the slides in 3D. Unfortunately for the rest of you, the slides will only be 2D. You know, it's our time-honored tradition in the web, best viewed in, so I apologize if you're only getting the 2D experience there. But anyway, so much has happened for the web, and I wanted us to go back. And so this is A Tale of Two Webs continued. I know, very creative title for my updated talk. You know, in some ways, the web is kind of the same today as back in 2023. We are still arguing about how to do state management and data binding, hooks and signals. Do you remember how, like, last year we took that term from the 1970s, pointers, and we used that to refer to variables that can update each other in real time? I mean, that was wild, right? We're just still arguing about CSS and all the new ways to do styling. I mean, there's been Bootstrap and OOCS and BM and Foundation, Atomic CSS, style components, Tailwind. But do you remember after that there was Fluff CSS? And that was huge until a few weeks later they came out with no Fluff CSS. That took over, and that was amazing. If I had one big regret still, though, it's that our industry keeps spending so much of all of our time focused on improving developer experience, with the assumption that it will trickle down, the developer experience will mean better UX, better user experience. And the shift from DX back to UX, that's an ongoing shift, and it's one of the most pressing needs, I think, that we still face even today in 2027. But so much has changed for the web, too. I was only hinting at the possibilities back in 2023. I couldn't have even imagined how profoundly the web would have evolved. I think the word that most comes to mind is acceleration, because everything is coming faster and faster these days. And no, I'm not talking about new versions of React or Next.js. As both builders of the web and users of the web, we are here making and benefiting from a completely different relationship between users, who are humans, by the way, and our devices. To the joy or possibly horror of many, the web today is a veritable digital cornucopia, a swirling maelstrom of AI-generated content, smart contracts on blockchains, 3D virtual worlds filled with somehow still viral selfie meme videos, and all of that seamlessly dancing across every single screen in our lives, from phones to tablets to watches to reality glasses to TVs to, well, you already know all of that. But what makes all of this work so well? The power of zero. I think one thing that most of us can agree on now is that the biggest pivot the web has gone through since I was on stage last time is that we pushed and pulled apps and content, kicking and screaming many times, out of the cloud, way over and beyond the edge, all the way across the wires and the waves, directly and locally onto users' devices. It's when we finally realized, or maybe just admitted, that our best chance to weave the web everywhere into our lives was for all of our devices to communicate directly with each other, peer-to-peer, to go fully zero server, as it were. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's jump back into the past, 2023, and let me remind you of the troubles I felt that the web most needed to start tackling and talking about and trying to solve. So there are certainly issues with the web here in 2023. So let's ask ChatGPT to summarize those for us. Please summarize why the current web is so broken. Well, number one, poor performance. Delivering apps from large apps from cloud or edge servers all the way to users' devices on each visit. Loss of access to your data when offline or when internet connectivity is unstable. And loss of information privacy. Thank you, ChatGPT. That's a great outline for this talk. Amazing, that was just 4 years ago. It feels like only yesterday. Time flies. So this poor redownload experience, the loss of access to data when offline or spotty internet, and basically no data privacy. Certainly not the only issues the web has ever faced, but they're big ones. We've come a long way. For those 3 worst sins of the web, we've seen a big turnaround. So many were doubters and naysayers, but a lot of us pushed the web forward anyway. And yet, if we too quickly forget the mistakes of the past, we're destined to repeat them. Some famous guy said that, I think. So what does ChatGPT have to say about the performance issues that we have when we're re-downloading from servers over and over again? Again, helpfully, ChatGPT says there are 2 main reasons why this is a problem. Number one, browser caches are volatile. The larger an app is, the more likely the browser will be to purge some or all of the cache resources between visits. And number 2, applications typically bundle most or all of their resources and code into single files. These big bundles, they have everything included, so even one single character that changes requires re-downloading the entire bundle size, and that's often multiple megabytes in size. You see, your apps live here in the cloud on these servers, but they don't run here, they run on a phone, not here. And those phones are a long, long way away. There's miles and miles of wire, and then we have to factor in the cell phone and the Wi-Fi signals that are separating the devices where your app is running versus the places where your app lives. And most of this app being retransferred over and over and over, of course it matters how often those transfers have to happen. The biggest lie that we ever told ourselves is that the web is a zero install experience. That's actually an absurd concept because actually the web is an install every visit kind of experience. So how often are our users reinstalling our app over and over and over again? And how many times is that wasting all of that download bandwidth? So besides those delays and timeouts, what other kinds of problems do we have to face? Well, even if we have fast and reliable internet, many people are still paying for metered connections, which means they're paying for all of those bytes that we're downloading. The users are harmed because they do not have unlimited internet the way some of us in the privileged parts of the world do. And by the way, batteries are being drained at an exorbitant rate because we're downloading all of this information. Of course, that is chewing up their device batteries. And there are places in the world where they don't have free and unlimited electricity to recharge their devices. They have to pay for the electricity just to recharge the device. The current model is just petabytes of wasted global bandwidth being shoved down the wire every single second of every single day, and most of that is completely unnecessary. It's wasting users' devices, resources, their time, and it's ultimately wasting their money. I think most people think that edge servers were the fix to that. And certainly they helped. They got it a lot closer, but there's still many thousands of miles from those edge servers to users' devices in their hand, and that's just too far away. There's far too many timeouts. Timeouts are far more common on the web than we wanted to admit. This was probably hardest for anyone to admit back then. I mean, let's be honest. There were a lot of huge and popular companies who fully bought into the idea of the web inherently needing to be a deliver on each visit type of experience. You have AWS and GCP and Azure, trillions of 2023 dollars invested, hundreds of thousands of businesses all over the world building their whole web presence right in the middle of the cloud. You had hugely successful companies like Vercel going all in on web infrastructure as a service. For decades, the web had just entrenched itself in this client-server model. It was really hard back in 2023 for most people to even imagine a web that did not involve servers. Understandably, a lot of people didn't like hearing that maybe the web needed to move away from the servers and directly onto people's devices. A lot of businesses stood to suffer their competitive advantage degrading if the web could figure out a way to truly decentralize itself. And obviously that wasn't going to happen overnight, and those companies would not give up quietly. So most people just dismiss this as an idealist pipe dream. But eventually pivot the web did. The tipping point seemed to rise up later in 2024, several years after Local First began chipping away at the foundations of the entrenched server-full web. I'm just glad that we finally reduced much of the stress in arguing about how to optimize our apps for delivery from server to browser. All that noise about server components and static versus server-side rendering and all that stuff about the core web vitals. Do you remember those? Like, LCP, CLS, I don't even know what those mean. They're so confusing and distracting. When we eliminated the repeat trip of all those bytes that they take to get rendered onto the device, when we just installed those bytes directly on the device once, most of this complication just went away. The smart folks who used to spend all their time on these problems, they largely repurposed their skills and their intelligence on, quite frankly, more important problems. The whole serverless thing from like 2018 up into 2023, I think everyone finally admitted that it was bogus. Everyone knew there were still servers in serverless, and that meant that most of the core problems of the web still existed, even if we shifted the blame of those problems to somebody else. It was so much better for users as the web started to make this shift, as it started to happen. When businesses started moving away from the web experiences of browser to server to locally installed, users didn't even realize much that things were changing, but over time, the improvements for users started to become much clearer. Some of the early companies that made the shift were the pioneers and the bleeding edge adopters. But by the end of 2024, it wasn't seen as weird or risky anymore at all. Businesses everywhere, large and small, saw the announcements and the case studies from earlier businesses making that leap, and they got excited too. Understandably, the dominoes really started to fall. So how great is the experience now in 2027, where web apps launch instant start mode on our devices? That's the same way all other apps have always worked. We used to say that 500 milliseconds would be a really great cold start time for a website, and now we know that it's 0 milliseconds. But that wasn't the only big problem the web needed to solve back then. So why is it that this lack of reliable internet connection is causing such a problem, and it's causing us to lose even the access to our data in our app? Because the truth is that even if the app is able to successfully cache all of its resources, almost all apps store your data remotely in the cloud. And that is typically touted as a convenience for you, because then you're able to keep all of your data backed up and keep it synchronized and always available across all of your devices. But if one of your devices doesn't have a connection, or if it's unreliable and spotty, well, then all of a sudden you cannot access your data. How many of you have seen this logo before? I see this all the time. You see, when you have no way to talk to the cloud, you are effectively data-less. When the cloud goes red and all the warning sirens go off, but while that's happening, if the cloud ever crashes, we have no access to our data because our data only lives in the cloud right now. So it makes me ask the question, and I think we should be asking the question, why don't we store it in both places? Why don't we store it on our devices and also in the cloud? ChatGPT has some answers for us on that. Why don't we just store it in both places? Unfortunately, despite many of our best efforts in the offline first and many other movements like that, they've gone under various different labels. But unfortunately, one of the problems with this is that the web application APIs that we have available to persist data are not reliable enough. We have had more recently movements to try to improve these things, and we'll talk more as I go throughout this talk. But there is a local first web movement which is trying to say we need to put all of the data first on these devices, but the web APIs have not really caught up to the ideas, the beliefs behind this. More is starting. Speaking of local first, there's a local first web development community group that has recently started up here in 2023. It's a fantastic community of folks. I encourage you to join the Discord, come to the talks, listen to what we're talking about trying to make this better future web for ourselves. This movement has so much promise, and it's one of the most exciting things for me here in 2023. Local first might have sounded like this niche idea back in 2023, but here in 2027, we all know that it is one of the most pivotal inflection points in the entire history of the web. I mean, let's revisit a few of the pivotal tweets from back in 2023 that signaled and summed up that mission of local first. We've come to think of the cloud as a convenient way to store information. But what happens when there's a problem with the server or the internet connection? Suddenly, we're unable to access our own data. We've become so reliant on the cloud, this loss can become debilitating. It's especially true for businesses or systems that rely on it. Local first data storage, on the other hand, solves this problem. With local first data, users can access and work with their data even when they're offline without relying on an internet connection. This allows for greater flexibility and productivity, especially for users who work in remote areas with limited connectivity. Since the data is stored and processed locally, applications that use local first data are faster and they're more responsive than those that rely on remote servers. Users also have more control over their data rather than entrusting it to remote servers that may be vulnerable to hacking or other security threats. It's important to point out that local first apps are just web apps. You can build with whatever web technology, whatever frameworks you like. Well, mostly. I think I'll be a bit concerned about using React to build local first apps if React sees React server components as the default React. That is a bit of a disturbing trend, in my opinion. It's not just a front-end library anymore, if we're being honest. It's not even a framework. These tools are becoming platforms with all of the inherent server complexity they're weaving into the way that you work on the web. And this is the complete opposite direction that we should have been going. So local first has been advocating as a primary foundational principle that we need to be storing users' data, first and foremost, that they should own and control on their devices. But web apps storing data on devices has always been troublesome up to that point. With all sorts of issues from 5 megabyte limits to purging data randomly, here's how I summarize those issues back in 2023. Unfortunately, right now, we're stuck with local storage and IndexedDB. And these are unreliable and can evict your data at any time. And as we said, they're limited to 5 megabytes. Yeah, of course, small amounts of data are going to be stored, but any large amount of data, you'd be crazy to store that amount of data that is really important to the user stored in such an unreliable place. There has been some progress to give us better full file system access. There's a whole standard for this that's been evolving for a number of years, and it has recently started to land in several different browsers. It's in Firefox and in all the Chromium browsers. Unfortunately, it's not yet in WebKit. And as you and I both know, we may be waiting a while for WebKit to adopt this. Progressive web apps, PWAs, I'm sure you've heard of those. They were the primary way that the web tried to expand its capabilities, like the file system API, for example, to have more parity with full native apps. PWAs are literally web apps that, along with built-on technology and capabilities built on top of a service worker, they can actually be installed directly to a device and act mostly like a real app. So speaking of these PWAs, there's another technology that's really inherent to PWAs, and that's service workers. But are these just novelties? Like, how is the service worker going to help us? Is it going to give us any control? So one of the main advantages of the service worker is that it gives you fine-grained control over the loading and the caching of your resources. Unfortunately, that's still limited by whatever web APIs you have available, as we just discussed. And unfortunately, most web authors are just neglecting these APIs. They're neglecting these capabilities. I would go so far as to say almost every single website on the internet should be taking advantage of this. And we have things like periodic background sync, which unfortunately is only in Chromium-based browsers right now. But this is a critical feature for being able to allow web apps to update themselves in the background transparently so that when a user loads it, it's already fully updated. They don't need to wait for that reinstall. You see, the service worker, it reorients our entire mindset so it puts the server into the client. Even the most non-technical of users understood back then how ephemeral and unreliable web experiences were. I mean, you would open up a website, start reading or clicking around things to explore, and then you'd get on a bus or on board a train or a plane and look back down at your phone, and the content and experience you had was now gone. It was dead. It wouldn't reload. You couldn't even scroll through the content that you had already loaded because the browser discarded the background tabs and forced a reload when you switched back. Users, understandably, really hated this. They never understood why real apps kept working, but web apps could just stop working. Maybe more than any other sin of the web, this was the thing that kept the web as a second-class citizen in users' minds. It's so much more beautiful and graceful of an experience now, isn't it? The web doesn't go away now when our internet connections falter. Most of the web applications that we see that are popular and widespread in use today, they've embraced this offline first and local first mindset. More or less, all of them are preserving our data locally on all of our devices so that we always have access to our own data immediately at hand. I mean, of the top 50 apps that are now downloaded on the major mobile platforms, now almost half of them are local first web apps. That's huge. Before 2023, there had been a handful of experiments into making local first applications that could scale up to huge user bases. They were led by forward-thinking companies like Ink and Switch. But today, there's hundreds of thousands of businesses and content creators who are delivering local first installed web experiences. The latest market research suggests that these experiences are now reaching more than 500 million active users every day. That's a huge chunk of the web and the world that has embraced what the web could be. I'm super proud to have been a little tiny part of this big movement that has reshaped the whole web. Let's revisit what I said about my employer, Socket Supply, back then, and how they would champion this effort. So recently here in 2023, I joined as a principal software engineer and part of the tech leadership at Socket Supply. And I'm super excited. I want to talk to you a little bit about what Socket Supply is doing that I think is really key to this vision for the future of the web. So we built a free open source hybrid runtime. It allows you to target a web app and put a native app component wrapper around it and deploy that to all of the computing device platforms. That is both mobile and desktop. So Windows, Linux, and Mac, Android, and iOS, and also even Chrome OS. So what we do is, like many before us, there are many out there. You've heard of Tower, you maybe even remember way back, like PhoneGap and Cordova and things like that. We wrap a very small runtime around the native web view of that platform, and that allows your entire application built with web technology, so you don't need to go learn new tech, built with web technology inside of the web view, and we augment it with special important extra capabilities. Namely, we augment it with full file system access and full networking access and full Bluetooth access. Three key areas that web apps need to be able to realize the vision of peer-to-peer, but can't build based only on current web API technologies. And we have the security models in place to make this work for installed apps. So what we think is that this is a very compelling story for businesses, because you already have teams of web developers that know how to build web apps. And we're telling you, you don't need to learn new technology. You simply take that technology and package it with a very small runtime. By the way, it's only 1.5 megabytes for desktop and only 8 megabytes about for mobile. Much smaller than like 150 megabytes of Electron. And all you have to do is wrap that runtime around it and then start allowing the full capabilities of that device to be available to your code. We expose these things in APIs that look very much like Node.js APIs. So the concept of progressive web app, the PWA, I think we're really just moving this a half step further forward to take the P from meaning progressive to meaning packaged, because these really are just packaged web apps. They are web apps that are given slightly extra capabilities that really unlock a whole world of possibilities for the future of the web. We're not just an option to Electron, Tower, or React Native, though, because by providing the peer-to-peer networking capabilities, Socket is in a class of its own. So peer-to-peer networking capabilities are the real big story, because they actually make the cloud optional. Think about how much you're spending on the cloud, and we just make the cloud completely optional. Now, businesses often start out with free or very cheap cloud services, but then by the time they've grown to scale, they're completely entrenched in a locked-in proprietary cloud set of solutions, and they can't move them around, and they definitely can't reduce or remove those dependencies entirely. So they're stuck paying these wasteful, huge ransom-level types of fees. And a peer-to-peer network that we've built that is encrypted, that is secure, that is scalable, will allow your apps to talk directly to each other, thereby tapping into all of the storage and compute capabilities of millions and billions of devices on the web, instead of only a few servers in a cloud. And you don't have to pay for any of that. All you have to do is get more users, and the more users that join the network on any of these apps, the more all of us benefit. It's interesting that peer-to-peer networks actually have the inverse capability, which is that the larger that they grow, the better they perform, as opposed to with cloud systems, the more people that come on, the more you have to scale it up because it starts to choke all the resources. In peer-to-peer networks, it works inverse. So the idea is that less data is going to be huge savings for your business. We think that local first means that you don't even need to send data to the server because there is no server. Maybe there's none at all. Or if you're sending any data up, it's a very small amount. And if there's no cloud data to pay for, you don't have to pay for anything hardly. Your apps can run almost completely for free because they're running on the shared capabilities of all of your users' devices. So apps with encrypted P2P. That is a thing that's happening like right now without the cloud as a middleman. We think this is better for businesses and for users. And maybe the only people it's not better for is the cloud. Sorry, cloud providers. 2023 was when Socket emerged to embrace the promises of this local first movement. The idea that apps should be built to default to storing user data locally on the device rather than defaulting to storing data out in the cloud. Along with many other great projects in the local first space, Socket bolstered these efforts to bring local first applications and those capabilities to the masses. And to break free from the ransom tyranny of the cloud, these apps have to be able to communicate with others without server middlemen. That means peer-to-peer. I know that might be a scary word because that might seem like some of the bad versions of P2P in the past, but we finally found ways to do this the right way. I'm not just talking about P2P like in WebRTC. I'm talking about native, fully capable P2P protocol. In 2023, Socket launched a stable P2P protocol that handles incredibly hard problems of NAT traversal and between peers without needing centralized stun and turn servers. A protocol where if two peers are only online at the same time and have discovered each other, they can talk directly to each other. Nobody has to pay for a server to transmit that data. But a protocol, unlike WebRTC, also works asynchronously and asymmetrically, meaning that two peers that can communicate even if they're never online at the same time. This works because Socket's P2P protocol is relay-based protocol, meaning your data, encrypted, is by default relayed through other peers until it reaches its destination. Through a wide variety of techniques like conflict-free replicated data types, apps communicating P2P like this, they can negotiate and collaborate with each other at arbitrarily large scale. Socket launched all of this way back in early 2023. It didn't take long before businesses got excited and started using Socket to build the same or even better app experiences for the users, keeping all necessary data and computation out on the P2P network. To date, tens of thousands of Socket-powered apps have launched since those early days way back in 2023. Most of these companies significantly reduced their cloud reliance. Some of them closed their cloud usage down entirely. Others left only the heaviest of compute and data activities out in the cloud, meaning that their cloud bills were slashed by 75% or more. They report profits are skyrocketing along with their buildings, it seems. And users of these apps have been happier too, if we're being honest. Apps start instantly since they're already installed on the devices. Data is local first in these apps, so regardless of internet, users can access their own data. And they get to keep using all their devices synchronized, either via the peer-to-peer interact or even more proximally, if there's no internet at all, through things like Bluetooth. And when communicating or collaborating with others, data communication is usually almost instantaneous, since there are no costly round trips out to the cloud to worry about. There's a lot of amazing things going on in local first right now, from its humble beginnings a bit before 23 to just 4 short years later, and it's really taken over the web. Arguably, it's now the default of the web to build local first rather than the old way of building cloud first. I don't think it'll be much longer before we go from reaching just 500 million users with local first experiences to billions of users. The cloud's days really were numbered, and they are numbered, and local first and peer-to-peer are where the future of the web is going to be built and experienced. There's plenty still to keep fixing, including the fights to keep our data private and the fight to keep centralized authorities from trying to squeeze and wedge their way in between us and our data. Those business models really just need to not exist anymore. Back in 2023, the problems were many and some solutions were just emerging, but the hope for what the web could be, it was great. The bets that we started making back then on local first, they really have started to pay off. In the now, a bit more than 30 years after the web was first commercialized and mainstream back in the mid-90s, it really feels like we're finally seeing the web realize its best and fullest potential. So as I wrap up my talk today, this quote from Charles Dickens' immortal A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted in it being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. Most everyone has heard these lines, but do you know what he means? He wrote these words in 1859 in a time of political turmoil about historical events that were set 70 years earlier than that. another time of political and social upheaval. Most literary critics agree that the point he was making was that back then, the 1700s, just as now, the 1800s, everyone likes to make bold assertions about how they're in the worst of times that have ever been. But more importantly, in those same times, there are those with the vision and the hope for a brighter tomorrow. The whole story of the web has been this same narrative. We built amazing things, then become frustrated with the downsides of what we built, became disillusioned with it all, and then laid out plans to rethink and work towards something better. So, just like Dickens, we can choose to accept the way the current web is, or we can choose to use it as the basis against what we hope for next. There are two webs. The web that we see now, with all of its good and bad, and the web that we will have out into the future. And back in 2023, I asked those of you in attendance to envision that future. What kind of web did we want to have when we got back here to 2027? Should we, 4 years later, still be arguing about signals versus hooks or SSR versus SSC? Or are we going to keep arguing about the ergonomics of framework code or where our CSS sits? Or are we going to rethink deeper assumptions about the structure of how the web connects and communicates? That was the more important topic to dig into, wasn't it? I'm really glad that we started to focus on those more profound conversations. Then, as now, whatever we choose to argue about and work on, we cannot merely complain about the web being in the worst of times. We also have the responsibility to start planning and building for the coming best of times. It's truly both the worst of times and the best of times for the web. Now, as it was in the past and will be in the future. What an exciting time to be part of the current web in the future. Thank you very much, profoundly, for listening to my thoughts. BJS Conference 2023 or 2027.